This move initiates the English opening, a flexible flank opening that immediately challenges central control and can transpose into various other systems, allowing white to steer the game towards their preferred strategic and pawn structures. This move initiates the Indian defenses, a flexible and dynamic approach that allows black to defer pawn structure decisions and develop a piece actively, preparing for kingside development. This move, NC3, is a flexible and common response in many English opening systems, aiming to develop a piece and control central squares while keeping options open regarding pawn structure. This move establishes central pawn presence, directly challenging white's flank opening and leading into complex variations of the English opening, often transposing into king's Indian attack or symmetrical variations. This move develops a piece and prepares to challenge black's central pawn majority, typical of many English opening setups. This move establishes a strong central pawn presence and prepares to develop the dark-squared bishop, often leading to a reversed Sicilian or an English opening structure. This move, 4G3, initiates a fianchetto for white's king's bishop, aiming to control the long diagonal and prepare for kingside castling in a flexible manner often seen in systems like the king's Indian attack or Catalan. This move, BB4, enters the symmetrical English variation of the English opening, immediately contesting white's knight and preparing to disrupt white's pawn structure if white plays d4. This move is a common response in the English opening, specifically aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially gain a tempo by forcing the bishop to move. Black resolves the tension by removing the knight that was putting pressure on f6 and d5, simplifying the position while opening the d-file for potential future rook activity. This capture opens the c-file for your rook and aims to exploit black's slightly compromised pawn structure on the queenside. This move initiates a common tactical sequence in this variation of the English opening, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure and gain piece activity. This exchange strategically simplifies the position, removes black's active knight, and creates a favorable doubled pawn structure for white on the d-file. This captures the central pawn, opening lines for your queen and rook while creating a doubled pawn for white. This move prepares to castle queenside and develop the queenside pawns, aiming to exploit the slightly weakened kingside pawn structure of black after the exchange on d4. Developing the queen to e7 unifies the rooks for potential castling and defends the e4 pawn, while also preparing to connect the rooks after the king moves. Developing the bishop to g2 prepares to castle kingside and opens the long diagonal for the bishop, which can exert pressure on black's queenside pawns and potentially target the f7 square. This move develops the bishop to an active diagonal, eyeing the c2 pawn and preparing to contest control of the d4 outpost. Castling kingside now develops the king to safety and connects the rooks, a standard positional goal after the opening skirmish. Castling kingside secures the monarch and connects the rooks, a fundamental defensive and developmental maneuver in this position. This move, e3, prepares to develop the kingside bishop and reinforces the central pawn on d4, aiming for a solid and flexible pawn structure. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square on the queenside diagonal, eyeing the weakened pawns on the queenside and preparing for potential pawn advances later in the game. This pawn advance aims to restrict black's bishop on b6 and potentially exploit weaknesses on the queenside, though it may create a backward pawn on a4. This move opens the central files and allows black to develop a more active pawn structure in the center after white recaptures. This move establishes a central pawn majority for white and opens the d-file, creating potential attacking chances along it. This move 13. A5 aims to prevent white's b4-b5 pawn advance, which could otherwise support the d4 pawn and potentially create weaknesses in black's kingside pawn structure. This move develops the bishop to an active diagonal, supporting the central pawn structure and preparing to contest the open d-file. Black repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to pressure white's pawn structure while preparing potential counterplay. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing the weak f6 square and preparing to potentially trade it for black's active knight if it remains on c5. This move strategically solidifies black's central pawn structure and prepares for potential pawn advances or knight repositioning. This move repositions the queen to the d2 square, potentially preparing to connect the rooks or support a central pawn push, while also maintaining defense of the e3 pawn. This move prepares to develop the queenside, potentially creating a queenside pawn majority and supporting the pawn on d6 while also opening a diagonal for the queen. The move "rfe1" aims to connect the rooks and bring the "f1" rook to a more active central file, supporting the central pawn push "e4" and potentially attacking down the "e file". The bishop retreats to a more flexible square, unblocking the d-file and preparing to reroute to a potentially more active diagonal on the queenside. This move opens the e-file, preparing for potential central pawn advances or piece activity along the central files, while also challenging black's pawn structure and piece coordination. This move, 18, rfe8, activates the rook on the e-file, preparing to challenge white's central pawn majority and potentially create attacking chances on the kingside or in the center. This move is a prophylactic maneuver, moving the king off the dangerous g1a7 diagonal and away from potential discovered attacks or checks along the e-file should black decide to advance pawns or activate their pieces. This move challenges white's central pawn majority and opens the c-file for potential piece activity. This pawn thrust aggressively opens lines for white's pieces and challenges black's central pawn structure, creating immediate tactical possibilities and positional tension. This move resolves white's central pawn majority and opens lines for black's pieces, particularly the rook on e8, leading to a more dynamic and potentially unbalanced position. This recapture maintains structural balance after black's pawn sacrifice and prepares to contest the open d-file for white's rooks. This move repositions the rook to an active file, aiming to challenge white's control and potentially exploit any weaknesses created by the pawn structure. This move activates the queen to a central square where it can potentially eye the kingside and support a kingside attack while also maintaining pressure on the d5 pawn. The queen repositions to f8, seeking a more active role by supporting a potential kingside pawn push or controlling the f-file, while also freeing the e7 square for a knight. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, eyeing the kingside and potentially preparing to support a pawn advance or coordinate with the bishop on d2. This pawn capture on e5 opens the d-file for black's rook and potentially creates a more dynamic central pawn structure, though it also removes black's central pawn shield. This recapture maintains the tension on the e-file and offers a clear path for further piece development and central control after the pawn exchange. This move activates the bishop and pins the knight to the queen, creating immediate tactical tension and potentially forcing concessions from white. This capture on g4 is a decisive tactical blow, winning material by exploiting black's undefended rook and forcing a favorable endgame for white. This move sacrifices the rook to open lines and disrupt white's pawn structure, aiming to create counterplay against the weakened king position. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square on the c3 diagonal, preparing to exert pressure on black's d5 pawn and potentially support an e4-e5 pawn advance. The rook's repositioning to the d file aims to contest control of this central open file, potentially supporting a future pawn advance or preparing for exchanges. The king repositions to the safer g2 square, moving out of the open file and preparing for potential pawn pushes or defensive maneuvers later in the game. The move seeks to reposition the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to control key central squares and potentially pressure white's d5 pawn. The recapture on c1 aims to activate the rook to an open file and contest black's control of the d file, preparing to challenge the advanced black d-pawn and support white's central pawn majority. This move creates a potential kingside pawn storm for black, aiming to open lines against white's monarch and gain counterplay. The queen repositions to the central square, aiming to coordinate with the rooks on the open d-file and support potential pawn pushes or exchanges to activate the remaining pieces. This move activates the queen, preparing to contest the central open files and potentially create threats against white's somewhat exposed king. This exchange of bishops clarifies the pawn structure and opens the d-file, leading to increased piece activity for white. The rook recaptures the bishop, immediately challenging white's dominant queen and centralizing the rook on an open file, which is a key strategic objective in this type of position. This move repositions the queen to a more active square where it can potentially support an advance on the kingside and also keep an eye on the d4 pawn. This move aims to exploit the open b-file and challenge white's queenside control by potentially creating tactical complications or winning material if white misplays. This move forces the black king into a more exposed position, creating tactical opportunities for white's queen and rook on the open files. This move is a desperate attempt to salvage the king's safety and create a potential mating net by activating the king, though the material disadvantage and exposed position make recovery highly unlikely. White simplifies the position by exchanging rooks, aiming to exploit the open d-file and potentially create a passed pawn on the queenside. With the rook now gone, recapturing with the queen is essential to regain material equality and prevent white from consolidating their advantage. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, preparing to contest the d-file and potentially support an attack on black's kingside if opportunities arise. This check forces white to move their king, disrupting their defensive setup and allowing black to potentially reorganize their rook and queen. For further pressure, this move prepares to defend against the immediate threats on the kingside, specifically the discovery attack threat with the queen and bishop if the f-pawn were not there, while also reinforcing the king's position against potential infiltration through the e-file. Black's capture of the pawn on a4 is a bold attempt to regain material, but it overlooks white's strong central control and the exposed nature of black's king. This move activates the rook to contest the open c-file, aiming to regain material and defend against black's aggressive pawn on a4. This move captures the white rook, winning material, but crucially, it neglects the defense of black's own rook on a4, allowing white to recapture with check and gain a significant positional advantage. This move prepares to recapture the pawn on a4 with the queen, simplifying the position and potentially creating a passed pawn on the A file while maintaining pressure on Black's king. This move develops a dynamic pawn lever, aiming to create queenside play and potentially break open the position on that side of the board. This move aims to create space on the kingside and potentially prepare a pawn push like g4 to disrupt Black's king's safety and gain attacking chances. This move attempts to create some breathing room for the Black king by pushing the h-pawn. But it weakens the dark squares around the king and could become a target for White's active pieces. The queen repositions to e2 to prepare for potential pawn breaks on the kingside or to support the central pawn structure while maintaining vigilance over Black's active rook on d4. Black plays a4, aiming to disrupt White's queenside pawn structure and potentially create an outpost for the rook or knight, while also restricting the advancement of White's pawns. This move aims to regain initiative by forcing Black to make a decision about their advanced rook, potentially leading to material exchanges or tactical opportunities. This pawn push aims to create active counterplay on the queenside, challenging White's control of the open c-file and potentially preparing to advance further to create a passed pawn. This move repositions the rook to a more active square, intending to potentially support a pawn advance on the kingside or prepare for a queenside counterplay.